Okay, I think we shall start. We're just a little bit over 4 o'clock now. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome along to Parker Bullen's first in a series of webinars. I hope you're all well this afternoon, and thank you for taking some time out of your busy days to join us. It's great to see so many people here. I think we've got about at least nearly 20 of you joining this afternoon, so that's a great turnout. So my name is Ketan Patel, and I'm a trainee solicitor at Parker Bullen Solicitors, and I'm going to be your host for this webinar. Essentially, that means that my job is just to push all the right buttons, ask any questions that come forward, and just generally keep things on track. So this is an informal sort of chatty style webinar, so please do get involved in anything that you'd like to. And you should all have a Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you could use that button if you'd like to ask any questions, that would be great. You'll have to type them in and send them through, and then we will try and answer and cover them as many as possible, either during or at the end of the webinar. So before I just hand over to today's presenters, just a few housekeeping rules. So essentially, this is hopefully going to be a 20-minute webinar, although we may be looking at about 30 minutes by the time we get around to doing some of the questions. We are recording this webinar, so it will be available to you all to view after at the end of it, and also in the future. And we will also, at the end of this webinar, send you a summary handout, which will give you a summary of all of the things covered in this webinar. And just to say really that the purpose of this webinar is for us to share with you some useful information, practical tips and guidance on the topic of employment law, in particular flexible working today. And any advice that we give is generic and shouldn't really be relied upon unless you've spoken to us separately and we've provided you with advice that's sort of pertinent and tailored to your business's, you or your business's circumstances. In today's webinar, we will, of course, be talking about flexible working and looking after your staff and your clients. And to present the topic, I would like to hand over to today's presenters, two of my colleagues. We've got Molly Dilling, who is a trainee solicitor, currently in her employment seat at Parker Bullen, and Alana Penkethman, who is our Chartered Legal Executive in Employment Law. So over to you, Molly and Alana.
Thank you very much, Ketan. So welcome everyone to this webinar. So I guess now, 6 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, we've all had to adapt, whether we like it or not, to new ways of working. And I think this is especially topical considering the past couple of weeks we've seen tighter restrictions. And I guess the purpose of this webinar is for us to talk about the legal implications of flexible working, because where before we may have gone into it home working practices possibly without the right policies, we now want to ensure that everyone, both employees and employers, are adequately protected and they implement proper practices into the workplace. So just to put a thought into your head that work is an activity and not a place, maybe just something to think about whilst we talk through this webinar. So first of all, I'm just going to ask a question, just a general question. How has COVID changed the way in which you work, and how have those changes affected your legal obligations as an employer, or if in any way at all? So maybe that's just something to have a little think about. And if anyone's got any thoughts about that. So I'm now going to ask you this question. Wouldn't it be useful if you could implement flexible and agile working policies to improve your workforce morale and increase your workforce's productivity without potentially exposing your business to risk of potential employment claims? Okay, so we just give a little bit of background. So there's two types of flexible working. So we've got flexible working itself, which is different working patterns but with structure to them. So rather than someone doing 9 to 5 Monday to Friday, they might suit their hours around their children or suit their hours around their religious needs. So for example, doing 7 till 3 or 2 till So flexible working is contractual, and people can apply to their employer to do it through a formal application procedure. The other type of working that we're going to discuss in this webinar is agile working. So this is something that you may or may not have heard of. It's effectively an evolution of flexible working. So although it has the same structure and the same principles in the sense that you can work different hours to what you're contractually obliged to, it's different because it's a way of working in which the organisation empowers its people to work where, when and how they choose, with maximum flexibility and minimum constraints to optimise their performance and to do their best work. So the key difference really is that flexible working focuses on the needs of the employee, as I've said before, whether that be for religious reasons, childcare issues, or any disability which would give rise to a new working pattern. Whereas agile working is different because it focuses on the needs of the business. So for example, this works in two ways. If you've got international clients, a 9 to 5 might not really work if they're in a different country, a different time zone, that they need to be contacted outside of those hours. But also, it's important to recognise that we're not all programmed to work in the same way. So not everyone will be at their most productive at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Some people might prefer to work at 7 a.m. in the morning. So that's the difference really, that it's suited around the business as a whole, rather than just the employee's needs. So one of the key points that I wanted to raise is that presence does not equal performance. So I think really we're all a bit guilty of it. I know I certainly am. When you're working from home, you don't mind sort of starting half an hour earlier, finishing a bit later, or only taking 10 minutes at lunchtime. And ultimately, you can end up doing a lot more hours than you need to. And I think, especially at this time, we've all suffered our businesses in one way or another because of the virus. So we've always felt like we've had to work more hours to ensure that we keep getting the work. But just because someone is in the office 12 hours a day or working from home 12 hours a day, it doesn't mean that their work is of a better quality than someone who's working for 4 hours a day. So it's less about where and when the employee works and how they can increase their productivity. And it's also should be driven by the business needs. So just a quick summary, who can it be used by? Well, in flexible and agile working can be used by all employees at whatever level. It can be done by senior managers, it can be done by trainees. And I think the key thing to think about is that we don't always need to be in the office. We've got good technology now where people can use Microsoft Teams, use Zoom to have those conversations, and they do not necessarily need to be in the office. Where? Well, whatever suits the business really, the customer and the employee the best. So it's based on, as I say, those three things: the business itself, the customer and the employee. And when? Well, again, the business, the customer, the employee, is whatever suits those people best. And why? Well, as I said, we've all had to change in one way or another due to COVID, but ultimately we've moved away from this Monday to Friday 9 till 5. People and clients have got different needs and different requirements. So flexible working is a really good thing to be able to suit the needs of all your customers, and actually firstly gain more clients potentially, because if your clients are able to contact you at different times, then you might be able to get, as I said, international clients or people who work shifts. It might be easier to do that. But also for employees, it's not like now we live within, for example, a 1 hour drive from the office. It's more than practicable now to have someone living, for example, we're based in Andover and Salisbury. We could have employees in Bristol, and because of agile and flexible working, then being able to work where they want and when they want, we can attract these new talent, and arguably we can attract almost better talent who wouldn't have thought to have come to our firm before this type of working. And how? The most important question. Well, Alana and I, as the employment team, along with a couple of others in our employment team, are able to draft these agile working policies, and we are able to advise on the best procedure for dealing with flexible working requests. So You've heard the background, but one of the most important things if you're going to start doing flexible working is to consider the legal implications of flexible working and also your obligations, both as an employer and an employee. So there is currently no statutory right to work flexibly. Therefore, the legal implications that I'm going to talk about relate specifically to the procedure and the decisions associated with an application to work flexibly and the practicalities of the flexible remote working itself. So I'm now going to pass to Alana, and first of all, please could you tell us a bit about the procedure for employees who might wish to apply for flexible working?
Thanks, Molly. As Molly's explained, there is a fairly formal process for flexible working in contrast to agile working. We have a statutory form that can be used, and if that method is pursued, then the employer has a number of formal requirements it needs to comply with. Some are simple, such as replying within 3 months of the application, and some are slightly more complex, but generally the main aim is that you need to behave reasonably, as with every bit of employment law. And you can follow the ACAS guide for that. If you want to behave reasonably when considering an application, you want to be genuinely considering the employee representations they've put forward. We are, as Molly said, sort of having a changing workforce, and there are, there's a lot of reasons to give it meaningful consideration to be able to, embrace site visits and out-of-hours services, things like that. And if you do want to reject the application, then you need to give a genuine reason as to why that is. And there are, perfectly reasonable reasons, such as costs, customer demand. It might just not fit your business, but you just need to give it reasonable consideration. And then the other issues, which are slightly more complex, are you need to make sure you don't discriminate, because there are a number of protected groups, protected characteristics, who will have obviously additional protection to other employees, and you'll need to bear those in mind, such as if reasonable adjustments need to be made, or if you've got perhaps pregnant employees, particularly at the moment, who you genuinely do need to be away from the workplace. And also just generally don't subject anybody to a detriment as a result of their application, and that can be either because they are able to work flexibly and they're going to be out of the office and perhaps miss out on opportunities for promotions, and they might be excluded from certain work opportunities. But also if their application has been rejected, then obviously they shouldn't suffer a detriment as a result of making that application in the first place.
Brilliant. What would you say, Lana, what sort of rights do employees have in relation to the flexible working, and what do you think that employees should be considering when they make their flexible working applications?
Okay, so some of the things that the employers need to be particularly careful about, obviously we've got reams of legislation in employment law, but the most obvious one is working time regulations. You want to make sure that if you've got employees who are out of your office and sort of out of sight, out of mind, as Molly's touched on, you don't want them working excessively. So make sure they're keeping to their contractual hours, and even if they're working them at different times, that they're doing the correct amount and they're not breaching the working time regs. And things, with overtime, it's very easy to slip into doing too much overtime, and you want to make sure that your employees aren't actually abusing that system. If you offer a higher rate of pay for overtime, you need to be monitoring when those employees are working and if they're selectively choosing to work during those overtime periods. We also have the Equality Act, which I've touched on, and in particular section 21 in relation to reasonable adjustments. Again, you need to make sure that you're providing the sort of aids and auxiliary aids to enable those people to work from home if they fall under a protected characteristic, or if they are, if they're shielding or something like that. So you need to consider it as a reasonable adjustment rather than just a request for flexible working. And finally, we have the part-time workers prevention of less favourable treatment regulations. And again, that relates to opportunities for promotion and development, and just to make sure that those people who aren't perhaps sat in the same office with you aren't sort of neglected in their career and professional development.
Lovely. So we've talked about the obligations on the employer when it comes to flexible working. What about the obligations on the employee? Is there any that the employee should be considering?
Yeah, that's right. So I think a lot of employees during this time have because we haven't had the time to prepare for it and do it properly, you know, there's been issues in relation to equipment and things like that. And actually, there is no obligation for the employer to provide it unless it falls under that section 21, which we've already discussed. So on that basis, the employee needs to provide any technology they need. And also, if they are providing it, they need to make sure that not only is the software adequate to do their job, it needs to be adequate to protect them from viruses and any security risks that you would normally expect to be protected from in an office. They need to have that, you know, ability at home as well. And also, you know, if you're working from home, the cost of your utilities and things are going to go up, and that might be you need to upgrade your broadband. You can pay for more in heating and lighting. We've joked before that, you know, my coffee intake is excessive, and I'm now paying for my coffee. And so all those things you've got to bear the cost of. And then you've got things like permissions as well. If you're working from home, you need to make sure your home insurance is fine with that, your mortgage lender or landlord, all those things. And finally, it's, you know, you've got expenses, and you need to agree that between the two of you as to what is, you know, what is reasonable for you to claim as an employee. You know, they will be travelling less potentially, but they may have disbursements if they're having to actually, you know, a few of us do still post letters, and you might have to pay for stamps, and you know, if you've got to pay for your phone calls and things like that. So it's just to make sure that everybody's expectations are the same and you're all on the same page and you know what you're doing.
So we know that working remotely can sometimes be lonely, particularly if you live on your own. And I think it's fair to say that the pandemic has probably had an impact on our mental health potentially. So how should employers ensure that their employees are being monitored on two facets really? Firstly, their performance at work, making sure their productivity is still high, and also their mental well-being.
Yeah, so you're right that if you're not, you know, dealing and working with your employees on a day-to-day basis, then it's easy for either their well-being to deteriorate or their actual performance. So if you can't have that regular day-to-day supervision that we're used to, then you want to make sure you are scheduling regular reviews. It doesn't have to be every day, but just to sort of check in and to make sure that everything's up to standard, and to try and grab things as soon as they start to slip, rather than, you know, letting things deteriorate away. And with the performance, you need to make sure that you are setting clear, you know, identifiable, measurable objectives, so that you can actually say, we need to achieve this week, and to make sure that it gets done, rather than, you know, just sort of letting them, I don't know, sort of crack on with their own workload. You might need to actually set certain objectives, and that's where communication will come in, that you need to be communicating about the work and the task that's being done, making sure that everybody understands who's doing what, so that things don't get missed. But you also need to be communicating to make sure on the well-being, and consider your contact methods about, you know, it's obviously really easy just to pick up the phone. I think one of the Zoom is great, and it's good for sort of, you perhaps feel a little bit closer, but actually there's nothing wrong with just picking up the phone every now and then, just have a quick 5-minute chat to say, you know, how you're feeling today. And I know one company has said that they actually make a point of, they have one meeting a week where they all meet as a team, and they're not allowed to discuss work at all. It's just for that, I think it's maybe half an hour or so, and they're only allowed to talk about non-work related things, just to sort of check in all that sort of stuff that you would normally have while you're making your cup of coffee in the office kitchen, or by the water cooler or printer or whatever. Is just to keep that sort of informal chat going, because that's the sort of thing that actually, after a long time, you can, if you're at home without family, can become quite a lonely place. So you want to just keep an eye on that stuff. And then finally, sorry, with compliance, I'm rambling a bit, that you want to make sure that once you've got these policies that set out those expectations and the things that everybody understands as to what the objectives are, what the rules are and everything, and get some sort of acknowledgement of consent. So whether that's a separate consent form or an amendment to their contract of employment, you just want to, want to document it really, just to make sure that everybody understands and knows what's going on.
Thank you. So as we are quite quickly approaching the end of the webinar, just as a little final point, Alana, we've spoken about monitoring your employees' performance and mental health, but how about employers who are possibly concerned about their business policy? So for example, ensuring that health and safety and data protection policies are complied with. What can they do?
But obviously those still do apply to home workers, and you may need to make some updates and amendments just to make sure it's relevant to each thing. Health and safety, you're going to still need to do your risk assessments for their working environment to make sure it's safe, and especially if they've got other household members at home, and you just think about how you're going to carry out that assessment. So you might not be able to physically attend the premises, especially if we all do go into a second wave of lockdown. And you might want to do it online, and you've got to consider your sickness and absence policies and how that may be harder to implement and monitor. But we can help you with all that sort of thing. And the same with data protection. That's another key thing that's got to be maintained even if they're at home. They're still data processed, they've still got to comply, and they've still got to keep everything confidential and secure.
Perfect. So I guess we'll just wrap up this webinar with a few summaries, a few top tips and easy wins that we would recommend. So first of all, review your current working policies and your practices. So as Alana said, ensure that your health and safety and your data protection policies are up to date. Review your staff handbook to check that whether it does actually provide for working from home practices. If you are a bit uncertain about whether you would like to continue agile and flexible working after the pandemic, consider trialing it at senior level. In fact, if you see your senior managers that it's working well then you can break it down and push it further to more junior staff, and that will build your confidence in the scheme throughout your business. Consult your staff to see if they are happy to continue with remote and agile working, and potentially your clients, to see actually if you can see the benefits for your clients. It might convince you to take it forward. And also during the recruitment process, discuss agile working. As we said before, you might actually be able to attract talent that you wouldn't have been able to previously because of geographic restrictions, but it's a really great opportunity to extend the name of your firm as well, by reaching out to people who are further afield.
Okay, just to finish up with really brief top tips, because I know we're running out of time, is just to make sure your technology is sufficient and adequate, and it protects your security and everything. Offer any changes on a trial or temporary basis. Don't make it contractual. You need to make that clear from the outset so that no one can demand they stay working at home afterwards. You want to establish clear, measurable targets and objectives. Keep communication flowing, and ensure all of your discussions are documented and backed up by robust policies, which obviously we can help you with, because if it does go wrong, you're going to need that paperwork to fall back on. That's it.
I think that concludes our webinar.
Excellent. Thank you, Alana and Molly. If anyone has any questions, please do send them through now. We have got a question here from Camilla for you both, Molly and Alana. And Camilla asks, if someone has been successfully remote working, can they be required to return to the office when they live with two vulnerable people?
Can you say that one, Molly?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question, because a lot of employees have probably got quite accustomed to working in that situation, of course, but I mean, just in general. So I think what it's really important is that you facilitate that if you can, but ultimately, if you are able, if you really want that person to come back in the office and you've made sure that your office environment is COVID secure and is safe, then that is the point where if they do refuse to come in, that's potentially going to be an issue if they're then effectively not following a reasonable instruction, which is a breach of their contract. However, saying that, I think it's really important to if they are certainly a good employee, it's really important to keep that communication and dialogue flowing and just accommodate them in the best way they can, because obviously it is a really challenging time for anyone. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Alana.
No, I think Molly's pretty much picked it all up. Hi Camilla, thanks for joining us today, by the way. I just wanted to add that obviously we've been quite fortunate with the furlough scheme, and it'll be interesting to see if we get a sort of second stab at that if things do become even more difficult. But that gave you some options as well, because the scope for using that if you need to be off for shielding purposes was relatively helpful. And then you've got, you may have provisions in the handbook already for sickness. You've also got emergency time off for dependents, which they could consider using. There's a few things there, but as Molly said, just keep reasonable and, you know, try and just come to an agreement by having sensible discussions, really, and to try and keep people on, even if it's a stint of unpaid leave, for example. A lot of employees would rather keep their job because we just don't know how this is going to, you know, go forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Molly and Alana. If anyone else has any questions, please do submit them through now, and we'll try and get to them. If not, do remember that you've got contact details on your screen there for Alana and Molly, and you'll also be receiving an email from us post this webinar anyway, so you can always reply to that with any follow-up questions that you may have. So, thank you very much again to Molly and Alana, and thank you to all attendees for coming along. I know everyone's they're very busy lives now, so it's fantastic that you've been able to find time in your day to come and join us this afternoon. Just to remind you, we will send you a link to the recording of this webinar in the next coming days, and we will also send you a summary handout which goes into a little bit more detail as to the points that Alana and Molly brought up in this webinar today. And generally, if you have any queries or anything, or any questions about anything that we've asked, or indeed you would like any tailored advice on the topics that have been covered, then please do get in touch. The next webinar will be next Thursday on the topic of wills, to be presented by two of our team in the Wills, Estate and Probate team. So if you're interested in that, I think the topic is going to be on executing wills and the difficulties and the methods in which that can be done correctly, given the new sort of circumstances that we all live in. So if you're interested in that, then please do subscribe for that, and keep an eye out for details of future ones too. And that's it from us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending and taking your time out today.
Thank you.